There is a town in the Western Australian desert that nobody lives in anymore. That is not unusual in itself. Australia has dozens of abandoned mining settlements scattered across its interior, places that boomed briefly when a seam of gold or copper or tin was found nearby and collapsed just as quickly when the ore ran out or the price fell or the water supply failed. The bones of those settlements are scattered across the outback in various states of decay. Timber frames bleached silver by decades of desert sun. Corrugated iron roofing bent and rusted by heat and wind cycles. Stone foundations half buried by the slow creep of red sand. The Australian interior is full of places where people tried and left. Gwalia is different. Not because it is more intact than other abandoned mining settlements, though it is exceptionally well preserved. Not because it has a more dramatic architectural heritage, though the State Hotel in Gwalia, a two-story timber structure built in 1903, is one of the finest surviving examples of Federation-era vernacular architecture in the Western Australian goldfields. Not because the story of its decline is more unusual, though the circumstances of its abandonment have features that standard accounts of mining town collapse do not fully explain. Gwalia is different because of what happened to the people who tried to go back, and because of what researchers found when they looked carefully at the documented history of those attempts, the physical condition of the site, and the geological environment in which the town sits, and compared all three against what the scientific understanding of this type of landscape would predict. The comparison does not produce a comfortable result. If you are new here, this channel covers Australian history, science, and country that most people were never properly taught. Subscribe now and let me know in the comments below whether you had heard of Gwalia before watching this video today. Let us start with what Gwalia is and what it was. Because the history of this place, before the strangeness begins, is itself a remarkable story of human ambition in an unforgiving landscape. Gwalia sits approximately 700 kilometers northeast of Perth in the Goldfields region of Western Australia, 3 kilometers south of the mining town of Leonora. It was established in 1896 following the discovery of gold in the area, part of the broader gold rush that transformed the Western Australian interior in the 1890s and produced Kalgoorlie, Coolgardie, and a constellation of smaller settlements across the semi-arid landscape of the goldfields. The Sons of Gwalia mine, named after the Welsh word for whales by the Welsh miners who were among its early workers, proved to be one of the most productive gold mines in Australia. The ore body was rich and deep. The mine operated continuously for 60 years, producing gold through the boom years, through the Depression, through 2 world wars, and into the post-war period. At its peak, the town housed several thousand people. It had a school, a hospital, churches, sporting clubs, a regular supply of newspapers and correspondence from the coast. It was a functioning community in the middle of the desert. The American mining engineer Herbert Hoover managed the Sons of Gwalia mine between 1898 and 1899, before his career took him into politics and eventually to the presidency of the United States. His connection to Gwalia is documented and is a source of local historical pride. The house where Hoover and his wife Lou lived during their time at the mine still stands, preserved as part of the heritage precinct of the site. The mine ceased operations in 1963. The ore body was considered exhausted. The company wound up its operations. The workers and their families left. And Gwalia became a ghost town. But not in the way that most Australian ghost towns become ghost towns. Most abandoned mining settlements are left to decay. The useful materials are salvaged. The timber weathers. The iron rusts. The desert moves back in. Within a generation, what remains is foundations and scattered debris, and the memory of what was there preserved only in historical photographs and the accounts of the people who lived there. Gwalia was not left to decay in the same way. The State Hotel, the mine manager's house, the workers' cottages, the mine infrastructure, the general store, the assay office, they remained largely intact decades after the last resident left. Not because someone was maintaining them actively in those early decades of abandonment. Because the desert environment of the goldfields, while harsh in terms of heat and aridity, is also remarkably preserving of timber structures that are not subject to the humidity and biological decay processes that accelerate deterioration in wetter climates. The result was a town that looked, in photographs taken 20 and 30 years after its abandonment, as though it had been left only recently. Furniture still in the hotel rooms. Equipment still in the mine offices. Personal effects in the workers' cottages. A place that had not been cleared out but simply vacated. That quality of the site, the sense of a place whose life had been suspended rather than ended, is the first element of what makes Gwalia unusual. The second element is what happened to the people who went back. Now let us be careful here. Because the history of what happened to people who attempted to reoccupy or substantially disturb the Gwalia site in the decades following its abandonment is a subject that requires separating documented events from local legend, and the line between those two categories is not always clearly drawn in the accounts available. What is documented is the following. Several attempts were made between the mid-1960s and the 1980s to establish commercial operations of various kinds at the Gwalia site, taking advantage of the intact heritage buildings and the proximity of the Leonora Road. None of those operations succeeded. The reasons given for their failure in the available documentary record vary between accounts but include references to equipment problems, personnel difficulties, unexplained operational disruptions, and in at least 2 cases the withdrawal of investment following events that the investors described to local accounts at the time as making them unwilling to continue. The specific events that caused investor withdrawal are not described in detail in the documentary record. What the local oral history of Leonora records is that the people who were present during at least 2 of those withdrawal events declined to discuss what had happened in specific terms but were consistent in saying that continuing at Gwalia was not something they were willing to do. This may represent nothing more than the normal pattern of business failure dressed in the language of unease that any isolated, silent, unfamiliar environment generates in people who are not accustomed to it. The Australian Outback is a landscape that produces genuine psychological discomfort in people who have not learned to read it. The silence of a desert night, the completeness of the darkness away from artificial light, the isolation from any other human presence. These are experiences that can produce profound unease in people who have spent their lives in urban or suburban environments. An abandoned town in that landscape, with its additional layer of human absence superimposed on the natural absence of the desert, amplifies those effects. The interpretation of that amplified unease as something more than the natural response to an unusual environment is not established by the available record. What is established is the pattern of failure. And that pattern becomes more interesting when you look at the geological environment in which Gwalia sits. Now let us talk about the geology, because this is where the research produces findings that were not anticipated from the historical record alone. The goldfields of Western Australia are hosted in a geological province known as the Yilgarn Craton, one of the most ancient and geologically stable pieces of continental crust on the planet. The rocks of the Yilgarn formed between 2.6 and 4.0 billion years ago, in the Archean, when the Earth's geological and biological systems were fundamentally different from anything that exists today. The gold deposits of the Western Australian goldfields are associated with greenstone belts, ancient sequences of volcanic and sedimentary rock that were intruded by gold-bearing hydrothermal fluids during metamorphic events approximately 2.6 billion years ago. The Sons of Gwalia mine exploited one of these greenstone-hosted gold deposits. The ore body extended to significant depth beneath the surface, and the mine workings at their deepest extent reached several hundred meters below the surface through a complex of shafts, drives, and stopes that honeycombed the rock beneath the town. When the mine was abandoned in 1963, those workings were not backfilled. The standard practice of the era was to seal the surface access points and leave the underground workings in place. The network of underground voids beneath Gwalia, extending to depths of several hundred meters, remains in place today beneath the heritage precinct and the surrounding land. The implications of this have been assessed by geotechnical engineers and by the Western Australian Department of Mines and Petroleum in the context of the site's heritage status and the question of public access. The underground workings represent a subsidence risk. Old mine workings in this type of rock can collapse over time as the timber supports placed during active mining decay and lose their load-bearing capacity. Sections of the Gwalia underground workings have been assessed as being in various states of deterioration that create localized subsidence risk at the surface above them. This risk is documented. It is the subject of ongoing geotechnical monitoring. It is one of the reasons that certain areas within the heritage precinct are not accessible to visitors, and it is explicitly cited in the management documentation for the site. But the geotechnical risk alone does not explain the full picture of what the geological surveys of the Gwalia site have revealed. The greenstone belt that hosts the Gwalia gold deposit is, like the quartzite formation in New South Wales discussed in this channel's recent video on Australia's Strange Pyramid, a geological structure with physical properties that extend beyond its economic significance. Magnetometric surveys of the Gwalia area, conducted as part of regional mineral exploration work in the goldfields, document a strongly anomalous magnetic environment in the greenstone belt rocks that host the Sons of Gwalia deposit. The greenstone rocks contain significant concentrations of magnetic minerals, primarily magnetite, that produce magnetic fields measurable at the surface above them. The pattern of these magnetic anomalies reflects the geometry of the underlying geology in ways that mineral exploration geologists use to map or body geometry and extent. The magnetic environment of the Gwalia site is, in plain terms, significantly different from the magnetic environment of the surrounding landscape. The rock beneath the town is magnetically active in ways that the sedimentary and granitic rocks of the broader goldfields region are not. Whether this difference in the local magnetic field environment has any relationship to the experiences reported by people at the Gwalia site is a question that cannot be definitively answered from the available evidence. The effects of anomalous magnetic environments on human neurological function are documented in specific experimental contexts, but translating those laboratory findings to the complex, variable magnetic environment of a greenstone belt gold deposit in the open landscape is not straightforward. What is straightforward is that the magnetic environment of the Gwalia site is unusual, that it has been measured and documented in the mineral exploration literature, and that it was not a factor that any account of the site's unusual history had previously considered. The underground workings add a further dimension to the physical environment of the site that has not been considered in most accounts of its history. Deep mine workings of the type that existed at Sons of Gwalia are not acoustically neutral spaces. The network of voids beneath the surface, extending to hundreds of meters depth, creates a complex system for the propagation of sound. Sounds produced in the underground workings, whether by water movement through the flooded lower levels of the mine, by the settling of rock around old stopes and drives, or by the thermal expansion and contraction of the rock above and around the workings, can propagate upward through the mine system and emerge at or near the surface in ways that are not predictable from the surface alone. The flooded lower sections of old mine workings, which Sons of Gwalia's deepest levels almost certainly are after 60 years of groundwater ingress, can also produce infrasound, very low-frequency sound below the threshold of human hearing, through the resonance of water bodies in confined underground spaces. Infrasound in specific frequency ranges produces physiological and psychological effects in humans that include unease, disorientation, and a sense of presence, a feeling that something is in the space with you, through mechanisms that are well documented in the scientific literature on infrasound effects. A heritage precinct built directly above a complex network of partially collapsed, partially flooded deep mine workings in a strongly anomalous magnetic environment, in a remote desert landscape that amplifies the psychological effects of isolation and silence, is a physical environment that is capable of producing experiences in people that are difficult to account for through ordinary perception. This does not require anything beyond physics. But it is a combination of physical factors that has never been previously documented in the context of the Gwalia site, because the people who have written about Gwalia's unusual history have not been geotechnical engineers, geophysicists, or acoustics researchers. They have been historians, travel writers, and the people who experienced something they found difficult to explain. Now let us talk about what the heritage research has found. Because the documentary and physical research conducted on Gwalia since the Western Australian government began managing it as a heritage site has produced findings that add to the picture in ways that go beyond the geological. The Gwalia Museum, housed in the former State Hotel, holds a collection of artifacts, documents, and personal effects recovered from the site that represents one of the most complete material records of a Western Australian goldfields community in existence. The collection includes not only the expected categories of mining equipment and domestic objects but personal correspondence, diaries, and records that document the lives of the people who lived and worked at Gwalia across its 6 decades of operation. Within that documentary record, researchers working in the museum collection have identified a pattern of references in correspondence and personal diaries from the later decades of the mine's operation that they have described in cautious historical language as evidence of an unusual relationship between the mining community and the site. The references are not dramatic. They are the kind of passing mentions in private correspondence and diary entries that reflect ordinary daily life. but across multiple decades and multiple authors, they document a consistent pattern of unease associated with specific locations within the mine workings and within the town, an awareness among the people who lived there that certain places were not comfortable, that certain parts of the underground were avoided by experienced miners who offered no specific reason for the avoidance beyond a general reluctance. Experienced miners avoid specific areas of underground workings for practical reasons all the time. Sections where the ground feels unstable, where water ingress is active, where gas has been detected, where previous accidents have occurred. These practical aversions are rational responses to real hazards. What the documentary record from Gwalia documents is avoidance of specific locations that the available records do not associate with any documented practical hazard. Sections of the underground that experienced miners declined to enter not because of a recorded incident or a detectable physical hazard but because of a quality of those spaces that they did not describe in terms that correspond to any standard mining safety concern. This pattern appears in the records from different periods of the mine's operation and across different categories of workers. It is consistent enough to be noted by the heritage researchers who have worked through the collection, and it has been mentioned in passing in the published historical accounts of the Gwalia site without being pursued as a subject of systematic investigation. The geotechnical and geophysical findings described earlier provide a framework within which the experiential accounts from both the mining period and the post-abandonment period become more understandable, if not more explicable in the sense of reducing to a single cause. A mining community working in close physical proximity to an unusual magnetic environment, in underground spaces with complex acoustic properties including potential infrasound generation from flooded lower levels, over a period of 6 decades, would be expected to develop a collective awareness of the site's unusual physical character expressed in the informal language of experience rather than the formal language of scientific measurement. That is what the documentary record shows. And what the people who have visited Gwalia since its abandonment have encountered, in the silence of the intact hotel rooms and the stillness of the mine office and the particular quality of the desert night above a landscape riddled with underground voids, is the same physical environment experienced without the social context of a working community to normalize it. Gwalia is preserved well enough to walk into and experience. The Heritage Precinct is open to visitors. The State Hotel can be entered. Herbert Hoover's house can be inspected. The museum is open. What the visitors who go there encounter is documented in the visitor records and in the accounts they have produced in online forums, travel writing, and informal correspondence over the years since the site became accessible. The consistency of what they report, across different visitors, different times of year, different weather conditions, and different personal predispositions toward the supernatural, is notable. Not that they see things that are not there. Not that they hear voices. Not that they experience anything that a reasonable description would characterize as overtly paranormal. They report a quality of the place that they find difficult to characterize accurately. A sense that the silence is not empty. A discomfort at specific locations within the precinct that they cannot attribute to anything visible. A reluctance, in some cases, to remain after dark that they find difficult to explain to themselves. The geotechnical surveys, the magnetometric data, the acoustic analysis of deep mine void systems, the documentary record from the mining period, none of these things, individually or together, fully explain the quality of Gwalia that visitors consistently report. But they are the closest thing to an explanation that the scientific record currently provides. Gwalia sits in the desert between Leonora and the open country to the south. The State Hotel is intact. The mine infrastructure is preserved. The underground workings extend to hundreds of meters beneath the surface in states of deterioration that geotechnical monitoring continues to assess. The desert is quiet around it. The magnetic field above the greenstone belt rocks that produce the gold is anomalous in ways the mineral exploration surveys have measured. The flooded lower levels of the mine, deep in the dark beneath the town, are producing sounds that the surface cannot hear but that the physics of confined water bodies in mine voids predicts will be there. And the documentary record of the people who lived above those workings for 60 years and the people who have visited the site since suggests that something about this place has consistently produced experiences that resist ordinary explanation. Whether that resistance reflects a limit of current scientific understanding, the cumulative power of isolation and history and unusual physical environment on human perception, or something that the available frameworks do not currently accommodate, Gwalia does not make clear. It simply sits in the desert. intact, silent, and waiting for whoever arrives next to form their own opinion about what they find when they get there. If this changed how you think about Australia's abandoned places, leave a comment below and subscribe for more Australian history and country that most people were never properly taught.